Welcome to my British History channel. This video is long, but if you stay until the end, you may finally understand why a small island changed the world. We often look at empires and marvel at their vast territories. We observe the reach of their navies and the wealth of their cities. Yet we rarely ask the most important question. What is the true architecture of power that sustains such dominance? We assume that nations become powerful because of superior military strength or abundant natural resources. But history whispers a different truth. Power is not merely a force to be wielded. Power is a chaos that must be managed. The future of human civilization has always been dictated by those who figure out how to build systems that contain the terrifying unpredictability of human ambition. This is not a simple historical retelling. This is a deep exploration of how Britain evolved from a savage, fragmented landscape into the architect of the modern global order. We will uncover how fear created unity, how greed birthed law, and how the endless struggle for absolute authority ultimately engineered the very institutions that limit authority. Here is the core truth you must internalize before we begin. Britain did not become powerful because of strength. It became powerful because it built a system that managed power. The real power of Britain was not its empire. It was the system behind the empire. Let us journey back to the very beginning. Chapter 1. The dawn of consciousness and the fear of the unknown. Summary. Before institutions existed, humanity built monuments to appease the terrifying forces of nature and time. In the farthest western reaches of the Eurasian continent, separated by a narrow channel of water, lies a small island. Before the concept of a nation ever existed, this land was a theater of raw human survival. The earliest inhabitants were driven by the most fundamental of instincts. They feared the cold, they feared the dark, and they feared the unpredictable seasons. To survive in a world without order, humanity seeks to create order. On the desolate plains of Wiltshire, the primitive ancestors of Britain dragged massive stones, weighing up to 20 tons, across immense distances. They arranged them in perfect alignment with the summer solstice. This structure, known as Stonehenge, was not merely a calendar. It was a desperate attempt to anchor the fleeting human existence to the eternal rhythm of the cosmos. Stonehenge represents the first stage of civilization. It is the physical manifestation of a psychological need for predictability. If the sun could be tracked, perhaps the universe could be understood. But while the stones remained silent, new waves of humans arrived. By the 7th century before the Common Era, the Celtic people crossed the ocean, bringing with them the technology of iron and the concept of agriculture. The Celts transformed the landscape. They shifted society from a nomadic pursuit of survival into a settled agricultural existence. They built hill forts, established tribal kingdoms, and worshipped the spirits of nature through their druid priests. Yet, their society remained fundamentally fragmented. Power was local, bound by blood and sword. They had created survival, but they had not yet created a system. Chapter 2. The imposition of geometric order. Summary. Roman legions brought not just swords, but the concept of centralized administration and urban civilization. In the 1st century before the Common Era, the greatest military machine of the ancient world turned its gaze toward the mysterious island. Julius Caesar launched 2 expeditions, seeking glory and wealth, but the fierce Celtic resistance and the treacherous weather forced him to retreat. The island remained untamed, but the Roman Empire did not forget. Order always seeks to expand into chaos. Nearly a century later, in the year 43, Emperor Claudius sent 40,000 soldiers to finish the conquest. The Celtic tribes fought bravely, but courage is no match for discipline. The Roman legions were not just an army. They were an instrument of systemic control. They crushed the tribal kings and dragged Britain into the sphere of Mediterranean civilization. The Romans understood that true power does not reside in the sword alone. True power resides in infrastructure. They built thousands of miles of paved roads, connecting military camps and facilitating the rapid movement of troops and trade. They established towns with plazas, temples, and baths, forcing the tribal landscape into a geometric grid of administrative control. London emerged as a booming commercial hub, yet this civilization was an illusion imposed from the outside. Society split into two distinct worlds. A small elite class embraced Latin, enjoyed public baths, and worshipped Roman gods, while the vast majority of the Celtic population remained in the countryside, clinging to their ancient ways. Order had been built, but it was not organic. When the external force vanished, the order would disintegrate. Chapter 3. The Collapse and the Cross. Summary. When the Roman system crumbled, chaos returned, only to be tamed by the psychological authority of religion. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was bleeding from barbarian invasions across Europe. The legions were recalled from Britain to defend the dying heart of the empire. The imposed system evaporated overnight. The stone roads deteriorated, the towns emptied, and the island plunged back into darkness. Without a structure to hold power together, society rapidly devolved into tribal warfare. Into this vacuum sailed the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic tribes from the continent. Originally hired as mercenaries to protect the weakened Britons, they quickly realized that a land without a system is a land ripe for taking. They swept across the island, erasing Roman culture and plunging the economy back into a primitive agricultural state. Britain fractured into 7 rival kingdoms known as the Heptarchy. But a king cannot rule by violence alone. Violence is exhausting, and fear breeds rebellion. The Anglo-Saxon kings needed a tool to justify their dominance. They found it in Christianity. The religion offered a compelling vision of an afterlife, bringing psychological comfort to a brutal world. More importantly, it offered the concept of divine right. When a priest places a crown upon a king, the king ceases to be a mere warlord. He becomes a representative of God. The church provided a bureaucracy, a written language, and a moral framework that demanded obedience to authority. Through religion, the fragmented tribes began to share a common identity. The psychological foundation for a unified nation was being laid not by swords, but by sermons. Chapter 4. The Threat from the Sea. Summary. An external enemy forges an internal identity, forcing disparate kingdoms to unite under a single law. By the 9th century, the 7 kingdoms were locked in endless rivalry. But human psychology dictates that internal divisions only heal when faced with a terrifying external threat. That threat arrived in the form of the Vikings. These ruthless Norse warriors swept down upon the British coasts, plundering monasteries, slaughtering populations, and systematically dismantling. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms won. By one, fear is the ultimate catalyst for change. As kingdom after kingdom fell to the Viking advance, only Wessex remained standing. In the year 871, a king named Alfred ascended the throne. Alfred understood that to defeat a superior military force, he needed a superior social system. He could not fight chaos with chaos. He had to engineer unprecedented resilience. Alfred did not just build fortresses and reorganize the army. He reorganized the mind of the nation. He promulgated a comprehensive code of law, bringing the population under strict government supervision. He commissioned the translation of books and the writing of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. He realized that people will only fight to the death if they believe they share a common cultural destiny. Through relentless warfare and brilliant administrative reform, Alfred the Great halted the Viking tide. But his greatest achievement was not military. It was conceptual. He fused the disparate tribes into a single people with a shared cultural and political identity. The threat from the sea had forced the island to consolidate. The idea of a unified England was officially born. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Absolute Power. Summary. The Norman conquest replaced tribal loyalties with a brutally efficient feudal hierarchy governed by land. In the year 1066, the destiny of the island changed forever. William, the Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel to claim a disputed throne. At the Battle of Hastings, he annihilated the English elite and crowned himself king. But William was not interested in simply wearing a crown. He was interested in absolute, unquestionable control over every square inch of the land. William brought with him the European feudal system. He declared that all land in England belonged exclusively to the crown. He then distributed parcels of this land to his loyal knights and nobles, not as a gift, but as a contract. In exchange for the land, they owed him military service and absolute allegiance. This was a masterstroke of political engineering. The feudal system replaced vague tribal loyalties with a strict, legally binding architecture of power. Every peasant answered to a lord, and every lord answered to the king. The chain of command was absolute. The island was now tightly bound to the political and cultural dynamics of the European continent. The English kings were now French dukes, setting the stage for centuries of continental bloodshed. But this system contained a fatal flaw. By giving the nobles control over the land, the king had inadvertently given them the economic base to one day challenge his authority. The nobles held the wealth, and wealth always demands a voice. The architecture that William built to guarantee absolute power possessed the very seeds of its own destruction. The balance of power was destined to fracture. Chapter 6. The chains upon the king. Summary. Driven by selfish interests, rebellious barons accidentally invented the foundation of modern constitutional restraint. By the early 13th century, King John sat upon the throne. John was desperate for money to fund his disastrous wars in France. He increased taxes, plundered church properties, and extorted his nobility. He treated power as his personal property, ignoring the delicate contract of feudalism. But power, unchecked, inevitably generates resistance. The nobles had reached their breaking point. In the year 1215, the barons raised an army and marched on London. They cornered King John and forced him to sign a document known as the Magna Carta. Let us be intellectually honest. The Magna Carta was not a democratic revolution. It was a selfish bargain designed to protect the wealth of a few hundred aristocrats. But its philosophical implications were earth-shattering. The document established two profound principles. First, the king could not levy new taxes without the consent of a council of nobles. Second, if the king violated the law, the subjects had the right to rebel. For the first time in history, the concept was written in ink that the law is higher than the king. The sovereign was no longer a god. He was a manager bound by rules. This council of nobles gradually evolved into the English Parliament. Years later, under Simon de Montfort, common citizens were invited to participate in this assembly. The monopoly of aristocratic power was broken. The system had learned that including divergent voices is more stable than suppressing them. Britain had unknowingly built the early machinery of modern democratic governance. Chapter 7. Blood, plague, and national identity. Summary. Prolonged war and devastating disease dismantled the old order and forged a truly insular nation. Because the English kings held vast territories in France, a colossal conflict was inevitable. In the year 1337, the 100 Years' War began over disputes of territory and royal succession. Generation after generation marched across the Channel to bleed on foreign soil. Initially victorious, the English were eventually driven out entirely by the resurgent French. The defeat was a blessing in disguise. Severed from the continent, the island could no longer pretend to be a European empire. It had to look inward. The loss of French lands forced the people to consolidate their unique insular identity. English replaced French as the language of the elite. A purely British consciousness was finally forged. In the fires of continental defeat, simultaneously, nature dealt a devastating blow. The Black Death swept across the land, eradicating a massive percentage of the population. The sudden shortage of labor shattered the feudal economic model. Peasants realized their value and demanded higher wages. When the crown tried to suppress them, massive peasant revolts erupted. The old social hierarchy was crumbling under the weight of economic reality. The aristocracy then turned upon itself. The War of the Roses pitted rival royal families against each other in a decades-long bloodbath for the throne. This brutal civil war slaughtered the majority of the ancient nobility. When the dust settled, the feudal lords were decimated. The stage was now empty, ready for a new dynasty to consolidate unprecedented centralized power. Chapter 8. The Mind Divorced from Rome. Summary. By hijacking religious authority, the monarchy centralized the state power and birthed absolute national sovereignty. The Tudor dynasty emerged from the ashes of civil war. Henry VIII inherited a pacified nobility, but he faced a different threat to his absolute authority. The Catholic Church in Rome held tremendous economic and psychological power over the English population. When the Pope refused to grant Henry an annulment from his Spanish wife, the king made a decision that altered the trajectory of human history. Henry did not just want a divorce. He wanted total sovereignty. He recognized that as long as his subjects answered to a foreign spiritual leader, his power was incomplete. In the year 1533, he severed all ties with the Roman papacy. He established the Church of England and declared himself its supreme head. The monarch now controlled both the body and the soul of the nation. This religious revolution was the ultimate consolidation of state power. The wealth of the monasteries was confiscated and distributed to create a new, loyal class of gentry. Britain was no longer subservient to any continental authority. It was a self-contained sovereign entity. This isolation bred a fierce sense of independence, but it also earned the bitter enmity of Catholic Europe. The transition was drenched in blood and persecution, as successive monarchs swung violently between Catholicism and Protestantism. But by the reign of Elizabeth I, the identity of the nation was cemented. Religion was no longer just a matter of faith. It was a tool of national security. The system had evolved to fuse spiritual belief with patriotic duty, creating an unbreakable social cohesion. Chapter 9. The Ocean and the Ambition. Summary. Blocked on land, the island turned to the sea, transforming piracy into a global commercial empire. Queen Elizabeth I understood the fragile reality of her kingdom. Britain was a small island, excluded from the massive wealth being extracted from the Americas by Spain and Portugal. If Britain could not conquer land in Europe, it must conquer the waves. The government quietly sponsored state-sanctioned piracy. Men like John Hawkins and Francis Drake ruthlessly plundered Spanish treasure ships. This brazen theft infuriated the Spanish Empire. In the year 1588, King Philip sent the Invincible Armada to invade England and restore Catholic dominance. But the heavy Spanish galleons were outmaneuvered by the swift English ships, and a devastating storm crushed the invaders. The myth of Spanish invincibility was shattered. The ocean now belonged to the English. Piracy soon evolved into organized corporate imperialism. In the year 1600, the British East India Company was granted a royal charter, giving it a monopoly over Eastern trade. The merchants realized that trade was not merely the exchange of goods. It was the extraction of wealth accompanied by military subjugation. They conquered India not as a government, but as a profit-seeking corporation. The empire was built not out of grand design, but out of insatiable commercial desire. The system had perfected the art of harnessing private greed for national glory. By monopolizing sea routes and establishing colonies around the globe, Britain created a self-sustaining economic engine. The island was now the hub of a global network, pumping raw materials in and projecting military power out. Chapter 10. The Machine and the Legacy. Summary: industrialization solidified dominance, but the brutal reality of imperialism eventually sparked its own decline. By the 18th century, the British system reached its ultimate evolution. Protected by Parliament, driven by free trade economics, advocated by thinkers like Adam Smith, and fueled by colonial resources, the island gave birth to the Industrial Revolution. In the year 1776, James Watt improved the steam engine, forever changing human production. Britain transformed into the workshop of the world. This economic dominance was ruthlessly enforced. When the Chinese refused to open their markets to British manufactured goods, the empire used military force to protect its lucrative opium trade. The Opium Wars smashed open the ancient Chinese civilization, forcing it into humiliating treaties. Gunboat diplomacy proved that the British system regarded morality as subordinate to commercial expansion and economic superiority. But empires are finite. The 20th century brought the horrors of the First World War. The unprecedented slaughter and colossal financial cost drained the wealth that had taken centuries to accumulate. Britain transitioned from the greatest creditor nation to a massive debtor. The colonies, educated in the British systems of law and nationalism, began to demand their own independence. The system had peaked and broken. The empire crumbled because the concept of freedom it inadvertently exported was ultimately turned against it. Yet, the institutional architecture lingers. The world today still operates on the principles of constitutional law, parliamentary debate, and global capitalism piloted by the British. The island retreated to its natural borders. Its systematic footprint continues to shadow the earth. History is not a record of heroes and villains. It is a brutal laboratory of human organization. Britain started as a collection of terrified tribes building monuments to the sun. Through conquest, plague, civil war, and endless greed, it engineered a system that successfully managed the darkest impulses of human nature. It created institutions that outlived kings. It forged laws that bounded absolute power. If power must always be controlled, and if chaos is always waiting at the edges of civilization, then we must look at the institutions we trust today. The British experiment taught humanity that true dominance does not belong to the strongest army. It belongs to the most resilient system. As we navigate the complexities of our modern world, the ultimate question remains: who controls the system that controls power?